A few years ago, if you wanted to make an animated show, there was basically one path. You pitched it to a studio, the studio either said yes or no. And then everyone spent the next 3 years developing stress-related digestive issues. Today, things are a little different. Independent animation is having a moment. Creators are funding pilots through Kickstarter, building audiences on YouTube, releasing shorts online, making entire shows outside the traditional studio system, which is incredibly exciting. It's also creating a brand new problem, because a lot of creators are jumping into indie animation without realizing they're accidentally making the exact same mistakes that studios make during development. I've watched amazing projects struggle to find an audience. I've watched creators spend years building entire seasons before testing a single episode. I've watched people ask for enormous Kickstarter budgets before anyone even knew what their show was. And look, making mistakes is part of the process. I've made plenty of them myself, but there are a handful of common traps that I see indie creators fall into over and over again.
27! It's a trap!
So today I want to walk through some of those biggest mistakes I see people make when creating independent animated projects. Not because I want to discourage anyone, quite the opposite. I want more people making things. I just want you to avoid accidentally setting your own project on fire before it even has a chance. An indie pilot can drop on YouTube and soar, but it can also stall out, shrink its potential audience, or worse, become the main course in this week's online outrage buffet. Hi, I'm Emily Brundage, and I create cartoons for a living. Over the past decade, I've pitched and sold 8 original animated shows. Most recently, I created my own original animated show, GOLDIE, for Apple TV. It's been nominated for 2 Emmys, including Best Writing. One of the most common mistakes I see creators make is believing their project is for everyone. And honestly, I understand why. Because when you've spent years developing a world and characters you love, it feels obvious that everyone else should love them too. Surely all 8 billion people on Earth are desperately waiting for your emotionally complex fantasy comedy musical about haunted pigeons. Unfortunately, audiences don't really work that way. One thing I talk about in my book, A Guide to Developing Animated Shows, you can get it in my YouTube store, is that every project exists within some kind of audience ecosystem. Even if your show is completely original, even if there's nothing else exactly like it, your audience is still spending their time watching something. They're watching shows, reading comics, playing games, following creators, and understanding those interests can help you communicate what your project actually is. For example, is your show lighthearted and comedy-driven like Phineas and Ferb? Character-focused and emotional like Steven Universe? Educational like Bluey or Octonauts? Is it a queer romance with adventure elements? A weird horror comedy about werewolves? A preschool show about sentient crayons trying to understand taxes? Okay, maybe not that last one. The point is that understanding your audience helps guide creative decisions, not because you're trying to copy something else, but because you're trying to understand who you're speaking to. If you don't know who your audience is, it becomes much harder to reach them, which brings me to the next mistake. Don't overpromise. Once you've identified your audience, the next mistake is overpromising what your show actually is. This usually happens during pitching, or marketing, or honestly, sometimes just talking about your project online. You might hear creators describe their show like, it's the next SpongeBob, it's going to be bigger than Bluey. It's basically the future of animation, which is a lot of pressure to put on a project that currently consists of a few character drawings and maybe a Google Doc. Sometimes comparisons can be helpful too. Maybe your project shares themes with one show and a visual sensibility with another. Mentioning a couple of relevant comps can actually help people understand what you're going for. It gives them a quick shorthand for the tone, style, and audience you're trying to reach. The problem starts when the comparison creates expectations your project was never trying to fulfill. If your show is a slow burn character comedy, don't market it like it's an action-packed adventure epic. If your show is heartfelt and introspective, don't promise audiences non-stop chaos and meme energy. Even a really good show can struggle if people arrive expecting something completely different. Think about it this way. If someone orders a chocolate cake and receives an excellent pizza, they're probably still going to be confused. Not because the pizza is bad. We love you, pizza, but because they wanted cake. Your goal isn't to convince people your show is everything. Your goal is to help the right people find it. And speaking of trying to do everything, don't start with a full series. This is probably the mistake I see most often. A creator gets an idea, they're excited, they start world building, then they create 50 characters, then they write an entire season, then they create lore, they create deeper lore, then they create lore for the lore. Then suddenly they've spent 2 years designing the economic infrastructure of a fictional kingdom that appears briefly in episode 27 of a show that does not yet exist. I understand the temptation. World building is fun. It's one of my favorite parts of creating. But one thing I've learned over the years is that ideas become much clearer when they're forced to exist in an actual story. That's why I almost always recommend starting first with something small, like a short, a comic, a proof of concept, a pilot, something that allows you to test the idea. One reason I feel strongly about this is because I've seen it work firsthand. Before GOLDIE became a series for Apple TV, it started as a short film I produced. That short gave us a chance to test the world, test the characters, and prove there was something worth building on before committing to something much bigger. Sometimes the shortest version of an idea is exactly what helps it grow. Because the truth is, it's much easier to discover what's working and what isn't when your characters have to actually do something. And if you're looking for help developing, stress testing, and refining your own show idea, I wrote a book called A Guide to Developing Animated Shows. It's already helped hundreds of creators take their ideas from cool concept to projects that are ready to be pitched, produced, or shared with the world. My book, A Guide to Developing Animated Shows, walks through the development process step by step. It's a comprehensive resource you can come back to again and again. Sometimes the thing you thought was the heart of the project isn't actually the heart of the project. Sometimes a character you barely considered becomes the most interesting part. Sometimes a story you thought would sustain 50 episodes barely survives 5 minutes. And that's okay. That's valuable information. One of the reasons I love pilots is that they let you experiment before committing years of your life or millions of dollars. You get to test the world, test the characters, test the tone. Most importantly, you get to see if other people respond to it the way you had hoped they would. Because making a pilot is much easier than making an entire season. It's not easy, just less impossible. Now let's talk about expectations, specifically Kickstarter expectations. Because every so often I'll see a creator announce their very first indie project and immediately launch a crowdfunding campaign asking for enough money to finance a small moon landing. And look, I admire the confidence, truly. I would love to wake up tomorrow and discover strangers are eager to hand me 6 figures for an idea they've never seen before.
Hey, it's $500, you have no choice of carrier, the battery can't hold a charge, and the reception isn't very—
Shut up and take my money!
Unfortunately, audiences tend to want proof before they invest, which is reasonable. If you're asking people to support your project financially, they're placing trust in you. They're believing you'll be able to deliver the thing you're promising. That trust is earned over time through consistency, transparency, and just showing your work. This is one reason I often recommend starting with goals that feel achievable. When I launched the first Strawberry Vampire Kickstarter, I wasn't asking people to fund an entire season. I was asking them to help me prove there was an audience for the idea. That's a much easier leap for people to make. Momentum tends to grow in stages. Trust does too. Build momentum, build confidence, build a track record. Every successful creator you admire started somewhere, usually somewhere much smaller than people remember. And building that foundation makes the next step significantly easier, which leads me directly into another mistake. Don't forget to advertise. I know, nobody likes this one, because most creators got into animation so they could make cartoons, not because they dreamed of becoming social media managers. But if you're making an indie project, visibility matters a lot. The reality is that there are more independent projects being created right now than at any point in history, or that I can remember, which is wonderful, but it's also very noisy. You can make something incredible, but if nobody knows it exists, it's difficult for that project to grow. This doesn't mean you need to spend every waking hour chasing trends. It doesn't mean every post needs to go viral. It simply means letting people know your project exists. One thing I've learned is that audiences love seeing projects evolve. They love feeling like they're discovering something early. And perhaps most importantly, if you eventually want studios, investors, collaborators, or audiences to believe in your project, it helps if they've actually heard of it. Which brings us to a mistake that's a little more emotional than practical. Don't get discouraged. This one is hard, because creating things requires vulnerability. You spend months making something, sometimes years. Then you put it online, and maybe it gets 20 views, maybe it gets 200, maybe it gets ignored completely. And suddenly your brain starts doing math. Bad math, the kind of math where one underperforming post somehow becomes evidence that your entire creative future is doomed. I've done this. Most creators I know have done this. The problem is that early performance doesn't always tell you much. Sometimes a project needs time. Sometimes audiences need time. I mean, Bluey didn't really become a hit until they were into their second season. You look back and most huge IPs happen that way. A great indie example is Gameaverse. Its creator, Ross O'Donovan, originally created the project back in 2009. For years, it existed as a passion project. Then, more than a decade later, it found new life through Glitch Productions. Not because the idea suddenly became good, not because its creator suddenly became talented. The timing was finally right. I think a lot of creators assume an idea is dead when it's really just waiting for its moment. And sometimes the algorithm simply looked at your post, shrugged, and wandered off to watch a raccoon stealing spaghetti. Most creative careers are built through repetition, not virality. And honestly, that's good news, because repetition is something you can control. Which brings me to one final mistake, and I think it's the biggest one. Don't wait for permission. For most of my career, the path was simple. Have an idea, pitch the idea, hope somebody in a high tower says yes. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe they say yes and then spend 3 years changing their mind. And while there will always be value in studios, development, and collaboration there, one of the most exciting things happening right now is that creators have more options than ever before. You can make a comic, a short film, a pilot, a web series, an animatic, a game. You can build an audience directly, and you can start now. Not because success is guaranteed. It isn't. Not because it's easy. It definitely isn't. But because ideas only become real when somebody decides to make them. I think a lot of creators spend years waiting for a sign, waiting until they're more experienced, waiting until they're more confident, waiting until someone important tells them their idea is good. But here's the thing, most of the projects we love today started before anybody knew they were going to matter, before there were fans, before there were